Welcome to Postdoom, regenerative conversations exploring overshoot grief, grounding, and gratitude. I'm your host, Michael Dowd. And in this conversation, recorded in early May of 2021, I speak with Fabian Scheidler. Fabian's the author of this book, just came out in English, The End of the MegaMachine, A Brief History of a Failing Civilization. It was actually written and published in German 5 years ago, but it's as timely as ever. It's very insightful, and we had a wonderful conversation. Here you go. So Fabian, at the beginning, I like to ask my guests to just share with us, because it's quite possible that many people, maybe most people that are watching this or listening to this won't yet be familiar with your work. So help us just help us to understand sort of who you are and what you're up to and what you're committed to in the world.
Okay, my name is Fabian Scheidler. I'm a writer. I write nonfiction books. I write for theater and opera as well. And my book, The End of the MegaMachine, A Brief History of a Failing Civilization, was recently published in English and French, and previously it was published in German. And it's a book that asks the question, how did we get into in the deep ecological and social crisis on a planetary scale? And the answer is historical. It's a narrative of 5,000 years of history. The origins of the first structures of domination 5,000 years ago, and then the structures of the capitalist world system, which emerged 500 years ago. And so I ask how this system works, because I think most people do not really completely understand it, because it's rarely discussed in the media. It's not impossible to understand it. It's you can understand it. It's based on some principles. It's based on accumulation of capital. It's based on states that are very closely linked to this economic machine, and it's based on some ideological assumptions. And so I try to unfold this history because I think it's like a map. When we have lost our way somewhere in the woods, and we don't know where we have to go, we will have a look at our maps and see, well, is this map accurate? Maybe we have the wrong map. Maybe we have an old map. We need a new map. And I think history is this. You get a new map, you see, oh, okay, that's the way we got here. And then if you know that, you can make choices of how to choose a different direction. So that's what I try to achieve with this book. And there was just a new book that has come out in German, which is called The Stuff We Are Made Of, Rethinking Nature and Society.
Yeah, wow. I really hope that gets translated into English, because it sounds like something I'd be really very interested in and interested in promoting as well. Well, the second question that I'd like to ask is, this series that I've been doing for the last year and a half is titled Postdoom, Regenerative Conversations Exploring Overshoot Grief, Grounding, and Gratitude. And I'm just curious, the term post-doom, does that have any meaning for you or resonance? Like what comes up for you when you hear language like post-doom?
Well, I like the word post-doom, because I mean, we have all these doomsday scenarios which Hollywood has produced for decades, and which are deeply rooted, by the way, in our civilization. I mean, I've written extensively in my book about the history of apocalyptic thinking, which started more than 2,000 years ago.
Yes.
And of course, we have this history of apocalyptic thinking, and we have a history in this civilization of producing the apocalypse. Yes. We have produced a mass extinction, the biggest mass extinction for the last 66 million years and so on. And we could really eventually destroy much of life on Earth. It's the first civilization capable of this. So I think we have to get post-doom in two ways. First, we have to stop this machine of destruction in some way or another. And we have to think beyond the idea that either everything will go down the drain, or we'll have a big bang and we are all dead, or we will continue the way we have done things for the last 500 years. I think the interesting thing is what is in between these two poles. How can we reorganize human life? Can we reorganize our economic institutions and our political institutions in a way that allows us to survive the transition that we will inevitably face? I mean, this civilization cannot go on like this.
Exactly.
A civilization that is forced to grow on a thinner planet is very simple, will not be able to continue. And the natural systems that support life are already beginning to collapse. So either we start a process of transition and we will have crises and collapses on the way, but we can build resilience, we can create other institutions, and we can organize solidarity. Or we stay in an illusion and we will eventually have a very hard landing.
What, if anything, has shifted in your own worldview since 2015, when your book was first published in German, and then now, and how do you, I'd be really curious to hear how your understanding of the present and the future, because I imagine your understanding of how we got here is probably very similar, if not identical, but your understanding of the present and your understanding of the future now, and if you were to rewrite your book, like this year or next year, what, if anything, would you change?
No, I think there wouldn't be that much change. I changed the last chapter for the French edition.
Yes, no, I noticed that when I read it, yes.
Yeah, which was so published almost at the same time as the English version, but it had to be printed much later than the English version. So I had more time, and the whole COVID thing was a little bit more integrated. And so my idea about our current situation is not so much different on an intellectual level, but in terms of how it feels to live now is different than 2015, because collapse is coming to the global north, which we see clearly with the pandemic. And probably it's not the last pandemic. Of course, pandemics have a lot to do with the way our economy and our civilization works, which has to expand forever to exist, because it's based on the endless accumulation of capital. So nature has to be turned into commodities. And so forests have to vanish and oceans have to be destroyed for the last fish and so on. And so most of the zoonoses that we know come either from wild animals or from animals which are incarcerated in some way or another to feed us. And now the feeling is different, because this pandemic really gives you a sense of how the beginning of collapse could look like. Of course, it needn't be the beginning of a catastrophic collapse of humankind. But what is clear to me is that this sort of civilization, which has a certain structure, which is based on certain institutions, principles, and so on, like any other civilization, is not eternal. Yes. So it will end in some way or another. It doesn't have to end with a bang. It could end in a different way, like the Roman Empire, in fact, didn't end with a bang. It was centuries of slow collapse, sometimes quite quick phases of collapse, and then a sort of reconstruction, and then it went on. It was a process of centuries. Normally, one sort of organization, of social organization, gives way to another sort of organization in this kind of processes, and these kind of processes have different phases. You have phases of seeming stability, which we had between the 2008 financial crisis and the pandemic, but the crises will come more often. So these are the other phases, crises when history goes very quickly. Many decisions are made which set up the possibilities for the future. And my view of, if you will, collapse or transition to something else, which will certainly, or almost certainly, take place in the centuries, that we will have these phases of apparent continuity and quick changes, crises. And I'm not deterministic in what the outcome will be. In every crisis, there are choices. That's a property of nonlinear systems. There are choices. And in the Corona crisis, I think the choices that we could have had towards a social and ecological transition were not made. Instead, the old structures were fed with billions and billions of dollars to save the aviation industry, the automotive industry, the banks, and so on. The old structures were saved. And there's some slight changes with Joe Biden, Bidenomics, it's called. I mean, it's some taste of a little bit of a New Deal, but it's not sufficient at all to face really the dimensions of the ecological crisis that we are going to see. And so we will probably get more crises, natural disasters, which are not natural at all. And so in the next crisis, there will be choices again. And so much depends on the way people are able to grasp the historic moment, to organize in these situations. But in order to organize, you have to understand what is going on and what the choices could be. And of course, this leads us to all the situation in the mass media where these questions of transition to another system are not even mentioned. That's why I'm not very optimistic as well that in a short period of time, the consciousness and the capabilities of organization will be there really to avoid a world which goes way beyond 2 degrees. More.
To my mind, that's the real wild card. Is that, you know, it's interesting. I found John Michael Greer's writings helpful. His model of catabolic collapse, partial recovery, and that sort of thing.
Yeah,
sort of an adaptation of Joseph Tainter's model and others. But what does seem to me to be a uniqueness where the collapse of industrial civilization, or as William Catton calls it, Homo colossus, how that is different. There's a number of things. One is that it's global. The other is that it's fossil fueled. And the destruction of the biosphere, the ecosphere, everything we depend upon has also been seriously fossil fueled. The other is that we are depending upon really civilization and certainly electricity having eternal life for there not to be a dozen or 2 dozen or more nuclear meltdowns, whether it's the spent fuel rods that are currently in swimming pools and the like, or whether it's actually some kind of nuclear accident or nuclear war or whatever. But that is so different than any previous collapsed civilization that I think it has to be factored in that we could see a, you know, whether there are a billion humans 80 years from now, or whether there are no humans 80 years from now, I don't think we can know that with any certainty. But in a 3 or 4 degrees Celsius warmer world, where there will be vast stretches of the planet that are uninhabitable, and there'll be certainly at least a few nuclear meltdowns between now and then, I don't think extinction can be ruled out. And I don't think it can be ruled out. That's why I think that the arrogance with which Guy McPherson and some others speak about the certainty of extinction just doesn't make sense, because we can't know whether there'll be 7,000 pockets of humanity in little outposts that are able to live more or less sustainably in those habitable areas. And so my work, my whole life, is about helping people come to terms with collapse, that it's not just a matter of will we collapse. We're already decades into collapse. It just, if you don't understand how civilizations contract and collapse, you're not going to see that necessarily. And certainly if you don't understand how biospheric collapse and the collapse of what we depend upon, the living world, all foreshadows that. So one, helping people understand that and come to terms with it emotionally, but then ultimately, as I said before, to come to that post-doom place of local action, living the best life possible, making as big a difference and being as big a blessing to others as possible, and planting seeds of healthy culture, healthy religion, which to my mind has got to be some form of indigeneity, some form of native heart and mind, some form of an I-thou, respectful, humble relationship to the living world, rather than a hubris exploitative relationship to the living world. So that's, so I feel blessed to have so many amazing colleagues, now you included, in this work, even though most of my neighbors, most of my friends, most of my family, they don't really get collapse, nor do I feel it my compelling urge to have them get it, but they also don't get abrupt climate change and how it's not just linear climate change. And, thinking that technology and the market are going to save what technology and the market got us into in the first place. That's why I so appreciated your critique of capitalism, not just the last 500 years, but going back to the Greeks, but market-based economies. Oh, by the way, yes, I want to get that quote from Karl Polanyi. You mentioned it in an interview, something along the lines of, if you commodify nature, you end up with a dead planet. Whatever that quote is, I want to get it, because I took a note saying I want to, but yeah, it seems to me that every market-based economy that treats primary reality not as primary, not as if it was God or a divine thou or a sacred being, but rather as a set of resources that can be extracted and monetized. There's just that's a dead end, and so yeah.
I just have a new book published in German, which is called The Stuff We Are Made Of, Rethinking Nature and Society. And it's exactly about this paradigm that nature is a dead object.
Yes.
Or that living creatures or living systems are made of dead objects, which is basically the assumption that modern science started with 400 years ago. And of course, modern science was part of the emerging capitalist system.
Exactly.
However, of course, modern science in the last century discovered that this is not the case. At the core of what we call matter, there is nothing that resembles matter. It's just energy fields.
Yes, it would be closer to call that consciousness or energy than matter as such.
Absolutely. You can call it whatever you like. And Richard Feynman, the Nobel Prize laureate physicist, one of the most important physicists of the 20th century, he said, well, if you claim to have understood quantum physics, you don't understand anything. You cannot understand it. It's beyond our minds. Right. And so real science is beyond this mechanistic worldview and this idea that the world is an object. But of course, popular science and all these people in Silicon Valley and so on, they still think that way.
Absolutely.
And in an even more extreme way. And all these ideas that we can geoengineer us out of the crisis that we have in fact geoengineered us into. And all this is part of the old mechanist worldview that the world is an object. And you've talked about indigenous religion, if you call it like that, or
I say life ways.
They have the idea. Many, it's very diverse.
Right, of course.
I've written a little bit about Western Amazonian indigenous worldviews. It's not that there's an object outside which is called nature, which we can be in harmony with, but it's all part of us.
Exactly.
And it's what the parts of the ecological movement now say: we are nature defending ourselves.
Exactly.
It's not that we defend an environment outside there. We change the molecules and atoms of our body every 2 months about. So what we do to something outside of us will be inside us soon afterwards. And so it's the whole idea of being that we are not, as Descartes had it, we are the absolute mind that can control the body, which is a machine, and control nature. All this is nonsense. And the more the civilization tries to control nature, the more it will destroy nature.
Absolutely.
And ourselves.
Absolutely.
And so the whole transition that we need, and that's so hard to achieve, of course, is, of course, a deep change in our economic institutions, in our political institutions, but also in the way we see the world and we see nature. And one depends on the other. I mean, if you live in an office, if you work in an office in Los Angeles 10 hours a day, and you drive home in your car and you switch on your television set, well, it's very hard to have a different worldview. I mean, you can read
Exactly.
books about indigenous worldviews, but you cannot really grasp the thing because the way you live is really part of the machine. And if you want to get out of the machine in your head, you have to also get out of the machine in your body as well.
Amen.
And in the way you live and the way you connect to other people and to other living beings.
Yes.
And so I think that's very important. And I also would like to add one thing, which is the idea that either we will have a collapse and an apocalypse in some way or another, or things will stay more or less the same, which still I think most people believe. I think there's a lot of room in between these two things. I think there will be a sort of collapse or transition to something else, but it depends so much on how we as society and as human beings cope with the changes that we will face, how we can organize solidarity when huge chunks of land will be lost due to climate change, due to abrupt changes in biospheric or ecological systems. And I mean, you see that in a hurricane like Katrina or so on. It's so important how people organize solidarity in these moments.
Yes.
And we must get prepared to this. And if you only think, well, the world will, we will all die anyway, I mean, you really, you abandon yourself and the people, your beloved ones and other people with whom you could really form relations that could form resilience to keep you going through the crises that we are going to face.
Yes. Yes, exactly. Well, I've got two questions. One is related to if we have dozens of examples of previous civilizations that have overshot their carrying capacity and then went through the many decades long, sometimes century or two process of collapse. And we don't have any examples of a civilization in collapse doing the right thing and making it a nice, easy transition to sustainability. What if it's impossible? Like, what if everything that you portray it, you know, towards the end of your book in terms of the things that we would really need to do the right thing, what if all of that's out of our control now and we're into runaway mode? How does that feel for you? Like, what I'm trying to get at is, what is your emotions with respect to the possibility that we simply don't succeed in making a smooth transition, and we're, you know, living in little pockets of humans surrounded in a very in a biosphere that's not particularly conducive to mammals larger than a small dog. Might be great for reptiles, but not for us mammalian types. How does that, how have you processed that possibility? Because it seems to me there's at least a 50% chance, maybe 80% chance that that's the case. And I'm just curious how that's been for you emotionally.
Yeah. At first, intellectually, I think also that the probabilities to have a smooth transition are not so great. In fact, it's not impossible, but civilizations cannot really change their fundamental institutions and laws. And so the question is whether we see a civilization break apart without humanity. I mean, when you see the Roman Empire, for example, the people, most of the people didn't die when the Roman Empire vanished. In fact, it was a liberation for all the slaves and even for a lot of peasants who didn't have to pay the huge armies and the bureaucracies and so on. So the collapse of civilization, even the Mayan case, which was studied by Jared Diamond, it was not that dramatic as Jared Diamond believed, we know today. So it's not that all people need to die, but of course the situation, as you pointed out correctly, today is very different, with about 1 billion small arms and about 14 thousand nuclear warheads and all these other nuclear devices and so on. There is no example in human history which is comparable.
Yes.
But I think the capacity of humans to imagine disaster is limited.
Yeah.
And it's limited for a reason, because we can stand only a certain amount of potentially traumatic experience and even of potentially traumatic imagination.
Exactly.
So I think we should seriously deal with the possibility of collapse. We should prepare ourselves in certain ways, and but at the same time, we shouldn't, and that's the way I try to do it as well. We shouldn't overwhelm our emotional system and our consciousness with apocalyptic visions.
Exactly.
It doesn't help anybody.
Exactly.
It's good to have real world scenarios to know, for example, what could happen if global food production will go down for various reasons, climate change, species extinctions, many others. But we should, as you mentioned earlier, spend a lot of time with people who we love and nourish ourselves. And if we do so, we can stand some amount of apocalyptic imagination without going down.
Exactly.
And if we become overwhelmed, we cannot do anything anymore, and nobody will be helped. So we have to sort of, and I think what Gautier in his book, together with Pablo Servini and others, wrote is about these questions as well. How do we deal with all these informations and facts without getting lost and going down?
Yes, no, exactly. I appreciated both of the books, the one that they wrote in 2015 and then the more recent one. I found them very, very helpful. The second question that I had for you was, is there a conversation that is your book that you just completed? Is there any discussion about it being available in English? Do you have any presentations on that topic or anything that you've written on that topic, translated or in English? Because the reason I ask is that it's been 40 years since I lived in Berlin, and my German doesn't exist anymore. So I'm just curious. I would really love to read this most recent book. Is there any conversation about translating it?
Yeah, there is some conversation. I hope it will be translated, but yet there is no editor who has really said we will do it, certainly. So, but I will let you know.
Please do, because it sounds like the kind of book that I would promote pretty highly. And I have an email list of 36,000 people and a fairly large following. So,
yeah. And no, I think it's in the new book, I really try to have a different look at science. And there was, a discussion in the 80s, which was very strong with people like Fritjof Capra and so on, who was a quantum physicist, and many others. Ilya Prigogine, a chemist who wrote about nonlinear systems, and they really try to build a bridge between modern science, which has overcome the mechanistic worldview and is way in a completely different place than what normal people learn at school about how the world works.
Yeah, unfortunately, many of the institutions of science still reflect a very outdated understanding.
Yes, that's completely true. The way I learned physics at school was still these models of atoms with the core of the atom as like the sun and the electrons spinning around it like planets. And of course, this is not the way the world works. And it's repeated and repeated and repeated because it really matches so closely the capitalist system, which needs resources which are separate, which needs humans which are separate. Like Polanyi pointed out that not only turning nature into commodity will end up on a dead planet, but also turning people into a commodity.
Exactly.
Well,
Yeah, I found
society.
that quote in your book. I just didn't find the other one.
Yeah. I can sure check it
Okay,
out where it is.
good.
Yeah, so I hope it will be translated. And unfortunately, I could not give any lectures on the end of the MegaMachine in the States or in Britain because of the pandemics. But I hope
Right, exactly.
one day I will be able to go a little bit on tour. And yeah.
Yeah, my wife actually this Thursday goes in for her second COVID shot. I've had both of mine because I'm a veteran, having been stationed in Berlin. So the VA hospital, Veterans Administration Hospital, called me a couple of months ago and said, "Hey, would you like to come in and have your Pfizer vaccine shot?" And I was like, "Wow, sure, that'd be great." You know.
Yeah.
So, well, I do want to ask you a couple questions that I've asked the others in this Postdoom series, which is really the heart of that series was people sharing their stories, their trajectory. Like, how was it for you growing up in terms of your understanding of progress? Because many of us, I mean, I'm 62, and I certainly had a sense of everlasting progress until I began to get an ecological, environmental worldview in the late 80s. Then that shifted. But you know, how was it for you growing up? What was your understanding of reality? And then how did it shift? Were there significant books or authors or things that happened in the world? Like, what shifted for you to bring you to the worldview that you have now?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I grew up in a very nice suburban area in what is called the Ruhrgebiet, the Ruhr area, which used to be the main industrial hub in Germany.
Mm-hmm.
And we had a nice house, and there was a lot of diversity around me in terms of it was cities and countryside at the same time. It was.
Are you oldest or youngest? Like, where are you in the birth order?
I have an older sister. She's 5 years older than me, and so we had all these middle class houses like ours, but 200 meters away there were working class areas, and my best friends were from the working class. So I had from beginning a feeling of transcending class boundaries,
Yes,
and
exactly.
so I was very lucky not to live in a closed bubble in a way.
Yeah.
But when I was 7, my family broke apart. My mother and my father divorced. 3 years later, when I was 10, my mother took me to Hamburg, which is a big city, and so I got a little uprooted. And this happened time after time again. 3 years later, we moved to Munich, then to Berlin. So the experience of being uprooted is very, I think, deep in my biography. So I feel connected to people who are uprooted for other reasons, people who lose indigenous people who lose their home because there's an oil pipeline built or something like that. So I think this is part of it. And then I started to make music, to make theater, to make movies, and so on. So I was very much someone who believed in culture as a way to communicate about our emotions and our worldviews. And then I became, when I studied theater, at first I studied history and philosophy, but then I didn't want to become just a person who just develops his mental capacities. I wanted to be a complete person. This is what I've been trying to do for 52 years now, to have both sides of my brain and my body integrate in what I do. And this is very difficult in this civilization because everyone expects you to get specialized.
Exactly.
Either you are an intellectual or you're a theater person or you're whatever. And when I felt that I became an intellectual, I did something else. When I felt that I became an artist, I just did something else. And so then after my theater directing studies, I went to India for 9 months to study dance, traditional classical dance in the countryside. And the world I discovered there was so different from the West.
Yes.
There were especially a lot of Adivasi people around, which are the first people, the indigenous people of India. There are many, many different native peoples in India, and their culture is extremely interesting. It's completely different from Hindu culture, and I got really intrigued by that and interested and studied it a little bit and so on. And at the same time, I saw how globalization and capitalizing was about to destroy all this.
Yes.
I mean, there were huge mining projects in that area where I lived and studied dance. And at the same time, the cultural industry invaded India. Usually there were excellent musicians and dancers in the countryside for weddings and so on. And then they started to introduce generators and big sound devices and so on. And so the musicians became obsolete, and the whole culture was going down the drain in a way. And so I saw from that view, from the cultural perspective, what capitalism does. And India became part of the World Trade Organization and all that. And when I came back, I started really to get a little deeper in the political context of all that. In a way, my impulse was to defend culture as I understood it, which is not to produce commercial goods for a culture market, but which is really to connect people and to unfold us as human beings in all our dimensions. And so I saw that this is destroyed all over the planet. And so I became a little part of the anti-globalization movement after the protests in Seattle and Genoa. Attac in Germany was very strong in those days. And so I worked a little bit for them. And so I started to do a lot of talks and organized events and so on. And then in those days, we talked a lot about the neoliberal age, the last 40 years. And everyone said, well, that's the core of the problem. Of course, it was bad and it destroyed even more than before. But I felt that the core of the problem is much deeper. That it's not only neoliberalism, but it's a whole civilization.
Exactly.
Capitalism, and even the roots go deeper when you go into antiquity and all these structures of domination on which capital depends. And so it was a journey for me in a way to defend humans and being human against being reduced to just a cogwheel in the machine. And my experience of uprooting and sort of, these are traumatizations, if you like. I think our history in Europe and the United States is very traumatic. And it's traumatic all over the world because colonialism really took over the whole planet. And so we are sort of all traumatized. And in a way, we need a sort of social healing process. And it's so difficult to achieve because it's in our institutions which re-traumatize us all the time through the way the work is organized, through the way our military acts in the world, through the way that we destroy the planet. And so in a way I try to combine culture as a way to organize social healing. And that's my journey, if you like.
Yeah, no, that's great. I'm curious, who are the people that you find that you're most closely aligned with? Mentors, friends, colleagues, like who are the scholars or the authors or the people that you feel the closest resonance with?
Yeah, they come from different places. My last book was inspired by a lecture by Noam Chomsky, which is called The Ghost in the Machine. You know, Chomsky has so many areas of intellectual work that he works in. It's not only his political analysis, it's not only his linguistic work. That was really a philosophical lecture on the mind-body problem. And
I'm familiar with that lecture. And in fact, In all of my years of undergraduate and graduate studies, 4 years undergraduate and 3 years graduate school, my favorite course was philosophy of language.
Okay.
And my second favorite course was philosophy of science. And so I've been reading Chomsky for 40 years
Yeah.
and am quite well aware of the breadth of his scholarship.
Yeah. So, and Chomsky was also, for me, very influential in the way he really defines an intellectual as someone who has a lot of privileges, but should use these privileges to serve people and the future of humanity, and not to accumulate more privileges and so on. But Ivan Illich was also important.
Yes.
I didn't know him personally. With Chomsky, I met once, and we had another long discussion about my book and so on. Ivan Illich was important as a critique of civilization. One of his pupils was Wolfgang Sachs. I don't know if you know him. He has
who?
Wolfgang Sachs.
No.
He's a German ecologist, and he has written a very influential, or he has edited a very influential dictionary of development, which is very critical of the idea of development. And so there's a whole tradition line from Ivan Illich to Wolfgang Sachs. And basically, it was Wolfgang whose lectures inspired me to really start my political work.
How do you spell Wolfgang's last name?
Wolfgang Sachs, Sachs.
Okay, great.
Yeah. And then in terms of analysis of the world system, Immanuel Wallerstein was very influential as well with his world systems analysis. I met him twice, and we did some interviews as well. And he was an amazing person and an amazing thinker, because he was, in a way, the first one who really tried to integrate the analysis of the ideological systems, the political systems, military systems, and so on. And then there were a lot of artists, of course, who inspired me. And the poet Hölderlin in Germany, for example, who is one of our finest poets, who was also a critique of production of this kind of traumatic civilization, in a way, that many influences from writers and artists as well.
Yeah, that's great. I'm curious, how do you, are there any tools or exercises or practices that you've found, that you find helpful on a regular basis, whether it's daily, weekly, or monthly, or seasonal, but that support you in staying in a mostly positive place in a pretty crazy world?
Yeah, that's a good question. One of the things I do is music. I'm not a professional musician, but I sometimes compose and I do music, and music really gets me into a different state of mind. It gets me into a state of connectedness.
Yes.
And so that's very important to balance the analytical work. And being outside in nature is very important as well, to spend as much time as possible in nature. And then, of course, we tend to overwhelm ourselves with the idea that we can make a difference if we publish another book, if we publish another article, do another video, and so on, and we can become our own MegaMachine, if you will. So I try to stop myself and say, okay, I do what I can, but I want to relax in a way as well. I want to not to become part of my own machine. And that's an exercise.
Yes, it
because,
is.
Of course, as you know, there's so many people really inviting you to things and so on, which is very beautiful. But at the same time, I have to keep a balance and spend as much time as I can with my daughter.
Exactly. Well, I was going to mention that parenting an 8-year-old is a spiritual practice or a relational practice or an exercise, whatever you want to call it. But it's something that calls forth our humanity, our full relational selves in a deeper way than just academic pursuits.
Absolutely. And also you see what we really can achieve as humans and our limits as well. Because
Yes.
if you are able really to get a child through these crazy times in a way that the personality of the child can unfold, that the child um, uh, evolves without fears and trauma and so on. That's a lot. I mean, and so there's, and if we look at it from a feminist perspective, if you like, most of the time, of course, women do this work, which is so important, and it's most of the time it's not recognized. Well, they take care of the children, and the men do the important stuff. But taking care of children in a way that the children don't become traumatized and that they will not re-traumatize others, that they will be able to create a different society. I mean, that's the most important and the most difficult work we can do. It's much more difficult than writing books.
Well, Fabian, this has absolutely been fabulous. And I just find myself so appreciative of the work that you've been doing. And I'm quite interested in reading this new book, if it comes out in English. Anything that you'd like to say to bring this conversation to a close?
Yes, I think that we should really see the current crisis that we are facing in a way as a lost opportunity. You will, because we haven't changed institutions, but we should learn from it. Like from the financial crisis in 2008, I think we should get prepared that we will see more crises of this type: financial crises, pandemics, ecological crises. And the way what we can do if we restart normality in the next year maybe, is to organize ourselves and to prepare for the next crisis, because in times of crises, decisions are made very quickly. And if people are able to connect, to share solidarity, and to have ideas for transitions, for economical, political, and so on, transitions, then we can make a difference in these crises. For example, we can put the money that is now put to save Boeing and Wall Street, we can put it into a decentralized ecological transition. So I think my idea is that we shouldn't get hopeless after this crisis, but look into the future and see that we will have more crises, but we can do better in the next crisis, to take it as an opportunity for profound change, which we really desperately need.
Yes, yes. That's great. Well, Fabian, thank you so much. Thank you for taking the time to have this conversation. Blessings on your relationship to your daughter, and I hope this new book does really well in German, so that it will be that editors will step forward enthusiastically to translate it.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was great to talk to you. And I hope we stay in touch, and maybe we will have an opportunity to do another talk with Gautier another time. Or
I would welcome that. And in terms of maps of reality, I just do want to reiterate that I found this to be the single most important book I've ever read in my life, William Catton's Overshoot. So I highly recommend it.
It's on my list.
For more information about this project, go to postdoom.com.